Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you'll all agree that that was an outstanding lecture, and I think your response testifies to your enthusiasm both for the lecture and for, I think, all that David Sanders has achieved at the university and in the course of his academic life. From my point of view, I must say it's a great privilege to be here. I come back and forth to university a certain amount, and I am always tingling with excitement when I return to the University of Essex, because I had a great experience here. And I must just say that I had a great experience here on account of a number of lecturers who gave me that great experience, foremost amongst whom were David Sanders and Tony King. Dave Mackay is here tonight in the audience, and as has already been referenced, has written on this subject. I think I spied Emil Kirchner, and I do see Emil in the audience, and there are a number of other personalities who endure in my mind for what they contributed to my education. So at the risk of modest self-indulgence, I hope you'll forgive me putting that on the record. It's been a great lecture, and like all great lectures, you've got us thinking, David. What, with your concurrence, ladies and gentlemen, I propose is that we hear first from members of the panel their responses to the lecture, and then after a suitable period, I'll try to be reasonably but not excessively flexible. I want to open up to you so that you can come in with your own thoughts and preferably inquiries, either to David, probably principally to David, or indeed to members of the panel. But might I suggest that we start with Tony, with Professor Tony King, and his response to what he's heard. And in broad terms, I'm looking to panelists to contribute for about 5 minutes each. But it's not rigid. And it can't be.
I will talk for less than 5 minutes, promise. 3 points very quickly, I think all consistent with what David was saying. First, I think there is a worry in this country, probably distinguishes this country, about the way in which Europe from the beginning has been built from the top down. I come from Canada, a highly federal country where the provinces retain an enormous amount of power. Our neighbors to the south in the United States, the states retain enormous power. Notice from the beginning, the EU insisted that students at all EU universities pay exactly the same fees as were being paid by the people at the home university. In the United States, which has been a reasonably successful confederation for more than 200 years, students at the University of Wisconsin still pay less fees if they are residents of Wisconsin than they do if they come from somewhere else. And I've actually heard an employee of the commission say privately in the bar late one night that he thought it had been a real problem for the EU that the people who set the whole thing in train were people who mostly came from countries that themselves had been built from the top down, as Italy has been, as Germany has been, as France was a long time ago. So that's, I think, a point that Europhiles need to contend with. I have another addition.
Did somebody say that she couldn't hear? Right, okay. Speak up. Not at all.
No, I'm glad you did. I'm glad you did. I like the sound of my own voice, and I can now hear it. The second point is to add a challenge to Eurosceptics to David's list. I think it's consistent with David's list, and it's simply that if we nevertheless manage to do well economically as a result of leaving the EU, David doesn't think we would, and I don't think we would, but even if we did, the notion that that would go with our being able to do without the EU is simply absurd. The idea that you can draw up the drawbridge and get away with it. The Norwegians recently commissioned a very high-class study, non-partisan, multi-party study of the effect of being out of the EU but economically closely associated with the EU. They decided that being closely associated economically with the EU had been a good thing. They were unequivocal about that. But let me just read you a couple of sentences from their report. Norwegian integration with the EU involves a massive transfer of power from national to the supranational European level. Norway's transfer of powers to the EU is not compensated for by representation and access to decision-making at the European level. For EU states, the transfer of power to the EU involves the replacement of national decision-making processes with collective decision-making processes. They give something away, but get something in return. The influence that the individual state achieves at the EU level counterbalances the loss of power at the national level. And I think one of the things that people who speak on behalf of UKIP conveniently overlook the fact that if you remain part of Europe economically, but sacrifice all of your say politically vis-a-vis EU institutions, you've not by any means declared independence. On the contrary, you have created what has been described as a fax democracy. You get your orders from Brussels without having participated in any way in the decision-making that's gone on in Brussels. Third point, very quickly, I think there's another risk in the referendum to add to David's list, and that is simply the first referendum held in 1975 was held at a time when, broadly speaking, most Britons still approved of their own political class. So that when the leaders of all the main parties said, yes, we want to remain in the EU, people said yes along with them. In 2014, and I surmise in 2017, a majority of Brits are going to be out of sorts with the political class, as they are now and look to me likely to remain. It could well happen that if there were a referendum on EU membership in 2017, what would settle it would not be people's views about the EU, but their views about the people in Britain who were in favour of Britain remaining in the EU. Referendums often turn out to be on something other than what they're ostensibly about, and I think 2017 could well be an example of that.
Okay, Tony, thank you very much indeed. Okay, I'm going to ask Professor Helen Wallace now to offer her thoughts.
Thank you very much indeed, Vice-Chancellor. It's a privilege to be able to share your celebration of the well-merited award of the Regius Professor in Political Science to this university. You are all entitled to be very proud of it, including those who've built up the record of the Department of Government over 50 years. In about 1988, Tony King introduced me to someone who he said was a very bright young man. He's still very bright. Thank you. And he's young at heart and remains very boyish. But it was nearly 30 years ago, Dave, not 20 years ago. Time runs away. I was asked if I would make one or two remarks about how people elsewhere in the European Union look at the British. And I have several points, and they're, I guess, as depressing as David's line that actually the British are Eurosceptic, because I think that's what people in other countries think too. What do we mean by that? The British are less and less in the mainstream of the debate and the discussion. The statistics on voting in the Council of Ministers show that British ministers are the most prolific no-sayers in council meetings. Those of you who follow the European Parliament will know that British parties, in particular the Conservative Party, are not well inserted into the party system, and that's now compounded by the substantial presence of UKIP MEPs. The British are exceptionalist. It might be a good thing we're not in the Euro, but we're on the outside track, not the inside track. We're not in Schengen, and we can all produce lists. So they're not in the mainstream is my first point. The second point, which is not quite what David said, but I think he would endorse it, that part of what characterises British language is an us versus them. that is now increasingly mirrored in the vocabulary of people in other parts of the European Union. The us versus them language has transmitted to Brussels. And I think that's quite hard to change. Third thing I would say, that there are important things that the British have persuaded other members of the European Union to agree to since Britain joined the European Union in 1973. Those include pushing ahead with the single market programme. They include the very strong historical British commitment to enlargement of the European Union, the fact that the British was such an anchor player in the development of the European common foreign policy to the extent that it exists. None of that is there anymore. Or at least none of it is there so clearly. Neither do the British feel a sense of ownership of those projects, nor are they seen by other member states as continuing powerful advocates of them. We've got ourselves into a tangle with the single market partly because of issues to do with the City of London. We've got ourselves into a total tangle on enlargement by becoming so resentful of, I'll call it free movement of labour, which has upset the Poles terribly, who ought to have been one of our best friends and coalition partners. And the British are on the back pedal in the development of the common foreign and security policy. So there are a number of ways in which there's, I guess, a mirror from the other side of the channel, from the mainland, if you wish, to what David has talked about. I don't know what's going to happen whether in 2017 or any other year. Shirley and I are both veterans of the 1975 referendum. If push comes to shove, I guess we face one of two scenarios. One is a reform scenario, and the other is a renegotiation scenario. And let me just say a word about each. A reform scenario, which is what the Liberal Democrats are advocating, is a narrative of modification. It's a narrative of pragmatism. It's a narrative of evolution. It presupposes not an us and them language, but a we inclusive language, in which coalitions of like-minded member states, including Britain, push for various things to be made better. There's a much sharper renegotiation scenario, which is a narrative of systemic change, the narrative of arguments over fundamentals. And it's a narrative over packages to be agreed, which then have to be ratified by whatever means they have to be ratified in this or that member state. And let's bear in mind that would include in other member states as well as in Britain, where we might have indeed find ourselves having a referendum. And that renegotiation story is a story of binary confrontation. I have no idea which scenario is going to be the more plausible one. I know which I prefer. And David is absolutely right to say, while much of that will be conditioned by developments in domestic politics in Britain, it will be affected by what happens elsewhere, both the cyclical things and the euro crisis and so on, and in politics in other member states. And it takes 28 countries to tango in the European Union. And just as in the UK, so in the rest of the European Union, there will be a cocktail of effective and cognitive elements that will weigh in the outturn. Let me just add on referendum. I remember meeting in, I suppose, 2004, one of the very nice Dutch politicians who'd had the bright idea of suggesting that the Dutch should hold a referendum on the constitutional treaty. And I said, why are you doing that? He said, it's a really good idea, nice to let the Dutch people have a say. And it exactly illustrates David's elite mass bifurcation. And I said, what do you think they're going to say? Oh, they'll say yes. I said, I bet you money they'll say no. I was not surprised for the reasons that David so astutely talked about. Thank you.
Helen, thank you very much indeed. Shirley, what's your take?
Well, first of all, I'd like to say that David has left me feeling even more worried than I was before, but on the basis of a very, very effective marching of the data to tell us a great deal that we suspected but didn't know. And I'm very grateful to him for having moved us from the suspecting to the knowing. Let me just tick off quickly a few things that have stayed in my mind as a result of the discussion. The first one is about the euro. I think there's a general recognition that the euro would, to succeed, would have to move towards a fiscal union. One of the reasons it's in so much trouble is because it did not take the step of moving towards a fiscal union and therefore fell back on the compromise, which was essentially German command of the situation because there was no alternative. And when Angela Merkel expresses what's clearly suppressed anger at the failure of Southern Europe to, for example, collect taxes, to deal with evasion, to deal with foolish forms of cronyism, you can see that she's trying to carry with her the German people in sustaining the euro, but it's not an easy thing to do and it's getting harder. So my first point is that the move towards a fiscal union, which is absolutely essential if there is to be an effective euro, is going to make things more difficult and not easier, at least in the short run. And you can imagine in the United Kingdom, there would be a marked absence of enthusiasm in the city for anything of this kind. Incidentally, we may as well be very blunt. The city's moral leadership is nil and getting steadily worse, and therefore we as a country to influence ways in which we might reform the euro are not any longer in a very strong position to make arguments to that effect. If you've forgotten the LIBOR, if you've forgotten the insurance system, if you've forgotten the most recent development of Forex, you can see what I'm talking about. It's nothing new. It's something that has come out and is deeply disturbing. Second disturbing point, which I think is well worth making, is that we paid a huge price for the efforts that Mr. Bill Cash made to ensure that the leadership of the Conservative Party took the Conservative Party out of the Conservative Union, or the Christian Democrat Conservative Union, which was the most powerful single political force in Europe. And in doing so, literally cut off the direct relationship between rank-and-file supporters of parties and what happened in Europe in a way that I think was, if I may say so, made Mr. Cash one of the most expensive MPs in history. And in consequence of that, what you now have got, as you know, is an inclination for the Conservative Party in Britain to become more and more divorced from the European Union as a result of its own choice. I think it was a very high price to pay. Number three, two puzzlements. The first puzzlement, and it's a very major puzzlement, is that there's a certain fascinating conflict in what David has told us about the fact that there's clearly a very substantial greater support for the European Union among people under the age of 30 than among people at any other age group. It's not a small difference. It's a very large difference. And one therefore has to ask the question, I think centrally, how does the youngest generation break down? Because on the whole, young people in Britain have suffered economically in the last 10 years much more than older people, much more, have done less well, have got fewer resources, are more strained in their resources. Look at housing, just to take one example. And then it's even more puzzling why they should therefore be supporters of the European Union, when, as David has pointed out to us, generally speaking in the population as a whole, more resources means more support for the European Union, less means less. But when it comes to generational breakdown, that doesn't seem to work anymore. And that suggests, I'm not saying more than that, and I'd like to hear David's comment on it, it actually suggests a stronger commitment among the younger generation against the resource advantage that would be with them if they were older people than you might expect without that factor. Within that factor, one other thing to say, which I think again is extremely important, and that is that among younger people, there's a very marked difference which is brought out by Peter Kellner in YouGov, showing that something like twice as many people support the European Union if they have friends or family on the mainstream European continent than if they haven't. Now, young people move much more readily on the European continent than older people do. I know older people go and settle in Spain almost always in Spain, in order to have a sunny pension retirement. But except for that, if you look at it outside that one issue of sunshine, which he makes a great point of, Peter Kellner, you then can see quite clearly that the main factor is this linking, this connection of friendship, colleagueship, and so forth, which is going to increase among young people and not among older people, which will drive things even further in that direction. I've only got 2 other points to make, and I think that they're ones which I'll perhaps again, I'd be very grateful for any comment to be made by David. The first one is that I think it's extremely important to look at the issue of the democratic deficit. The democratic deficit leaps at one because of the relative weakness of the European Parliament's link back to its constituencies. Not the European Parliament's own weakness. It isn't a particularly weak Parliament. It's actually got quite a lot of influence, growing steadily. But when you look at the number of people in this country who could name their MEP, I suspect it's, I don't know, I suspect it's well below 20%. Whereas they could name their Westminster MP, probably something of the order of 60 to 70 or even 80%. Huge difference. People don't relate to their MEP. They do relate, or they often dislike and criticise their Westminster MP, but at least they know who he or she is, even if they don't like what they know about him or her. Final point, which I think is worth mentioning. I personally think, I'll put it very strongly, UKIP is a march to the past. It's based on the fact that Britain, as a country, admires and remembers its empire, but doesn't know quite what to make of its Commonwealth. It quite likes the idea of the Commonwealth, the Queen likes the idea of the Commonwealth, the public likes the idea of the Commonwealth, but they don't have any very strong sense of what it is, except a sort of bunch of nice guys who talk to one another quite happily and are in the Olympics together and are in wars together. But their other purpose, their political purpose, is not very clear. That means that people think back a lot of the time, especially older people. And I have to say that I think Britain suffers from a very major disease called nostalgia, which it's found it almost impossible to get over, even in the last 30 years.
Shirley, thank you very much indeed. I was exhorted by Shirley, ladies and gentlemen, to lob a few thoughts of my own into the pot. So if you approve of that, then you can thank her. And if you disapprove of her, the blame should be lobbed firmly in her direction. I ought to say at the outset, by the way, with reference to the lady who politely complained that she couldn't hear, that it's my normal practice when speaking at a meeting to ask whether the people at the back can hear me. I chose prudently, I thought, on this occasion not to do so, because last time I did ask that question, some wag rather unhelpfully replied, yes, but I'll happily change places with somebody who can't. But there you go. David will come back in due course, either on Shirley's point or in response, if he's content, to observations from the audience. Perhaps I can just say the following things. First, I rather agree with Shirley about the inability of voters to identify who their member of the European Parliament is. 'Twas ever thus, ladies and gentlemen, but 'tis worse now as a result of a truly absurd piece of self-inflicted damage on the part of the European Union as a whole. And as far as Britain is concerned, it is worse since the electoral system for electing members of the European Parliament was changed. And specifically, you will recall that in the past, you did have a designated member of the European Parliament, albeit that he or she represented a rather large and often amorphous region with which you had no great personal identification, but at least it wasn't even a region, it was a sub-region. There used to be a member of the European Parliament, for example, covering my constituency and several others, for Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire. There is now no member of the European Parliament for Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire. There are several members of the European Parliament for the South East region. And I won't say none of us knows who they are, but most people, frankly, haven't got a clue who their European parliamentarian is. And on the whole, I think that has been damaging in an era in which disengagement from the EU and the European Parliament amongst voters is in any case high, and it seems to me to have been a phenomenon exacerbated as a result of that unnecessary piece of electoral tinkering. Secondly, I think, for what it's worth, if the European Union wants Britain to stay in it, and for anyone who wants Britain to stay in it, pursuit of the arguments for fiscal union is extremely unwise. Now, it may well be that fiscal union is indeed absolutely essential for the further advance of the overall objectives of the union, in which case it's perfectly honourable to pursue that case. But all I'm saying is that I do not think there are many takers amongst the British electorate for a greater and greater arrogation of resources from member states to a central force within the union. The idea that there will be takers for 20 or 30% of resources to be lodged centrally, is for the birds. Thirdly, I was fascinated by the point in David's graph, which said that there is, and he recognised that this required further research and validation, a guesstimated 70 to 80 billion pound boon to the UK flowing from membership, which would not apply if we weren't members. Now, I'm not saying, David, that that argument or that claim is untrue. I'm certainly claiming that at the moment I don't think it has any purchase on the average British voter. For it to have purchase, it would need both to be validated and then to be repeated with monotonous regularity. An American once taught me, John, people don't get it until the 500th hit. And that's not because he was arguing that people are stupid, but most people are preoccupied with other things, and therefore an argument needs to be made over and over and over and over and over again. And only at the point at which the person making the argument has sufficiently bored him or herself is there the remotest prospect that it will have registered in the minds of voters and be a compelling factor in determining their point of view. Next, I would argue, for what it's worth, that Tony was right to raise this question of leaders' effectiveness. In other words, going back to the 75 referendum, when Shirley and Roy Jenkins and Ted Heath and Jim Callaghan and actually Margaret Thatcher were arguing in favour of staying in, the fact that they, as mainstream, generally respected political leaders, were arguing that case helped win the day. And the romantics, and I say that in a non-pejorative sense, but the romantics on the hard left and the hard right, notably on the left, Tony Benn and Michael Foot, and on the right, Enoch Powell, might have attracted large audiences of dedicated enthusiasts for them, but they carried no great weight with the bulk of the undecideds. Now, in short, what we're saying is then the political leaders were effective in bringing people with them. If the political leaders this time of the major parties other than UKIP, that is to say Conservative, Labour and Liberal Democrat, are arguing for staying in, will it be effective or will there be the opposite reaction because we're in an anti-politics age, decline of deference and general hostility to political classes and political leaders? Well, all I'd just like to plant in your minds is this. It may be that it will work the opposite way this time, but I've just got a sort of feeling that if you look to the Scottish referendum, actually, in those closing days, when the political establishment allegedly and justifiably panicked a bit, I think there's some evidence that the political leaders all reinforcing the argument for Scotland remaining in, and certainly Gordon Brown's pitch, maybe mainly Gordon's pitch, was effective. And I just wonder whether it might be in this case. And the last point I would make is this. I think, for what it's worth, what would be quite interesting to add to David's brilliant thesis, because it's one thing, if I may say so, I don't think was really treated of in it, would be to have a greater sense, not just of who is Eurosceptic and who isn't, but to have a sense of the depth of that conviction. Because although it may be true that the British people on the whole are Eurosceptic, I would argue that a lot of that Euroscepticism is skin deep, and I'm not sure how much of it would endure in the course of a concentrated period of campaigning in which the arguments for staying in were highlighted as well as the arguments for coming out. And I conclude that point by saying it's not new. A rather neurotic attitude on the part of Brits to Europe is not recent, but of long standing. As long ago as 1938, Churchill said in a speech, "We are with Europe, but not of it. We are linked, but not comprised. We are interested and associated, but not absorbed." And if European statesmen should address us in the words which were used of old, "Shall we speak for thee to the king or captain of the host?" we should reply, "Nay, sir, for we dwell among our own people." Now that rather sounded like an argument for keeping out, but I've heard people invoke Churchill in support of European integration, principally in the Tory party, Michael Heseltine, with very great persistence, and people argue the opposite. Norman Tebbit, I've heard, invoke Churchill against. I think the truth is, probably, Churchill was broadly sympathetic to the European project, but sceptical of whether Britain should be part of it. But my central point here is I think that the scepticism is skin deep. I think the case for a referendum, if I may politely say so, whatever the anxieties about it, is quite strong when the major political parties are broadly taking the same view, and if we haven't had a referendum for nearly 40 years. So I suspect that we will get one, and I know we're always accused of sitting on the fence and expressing no view, so at the risk of incurring some criticism for offering a view, I'm going to say that I think that in the end, for all that people are unhappy with all sorts of features of British European Union membership, I still think at the 59th minute after the 11th hour, people will actually say, we're not all that thrilled with it, and we're probably going to continue to be rather niggling and curmudgeonly members of it, but on the whole, our fear of being out is greater than our fear of being in. Deeply unenthusiastic, not the sort of dewy-eyed Europeanism which was dear to the heart of Roy Jenkins or Ted Heath, but I think that's what you're going to find is the outcome. Sorry? Do you agree?
I don't.
You don't? You think they'll vote to come out? Well, enough from us for the time being, and certainly enough from me. What do you think? Come on, who are we going to get from this audience? I've spotted the lady up there. Let's take you. You looking round with the grey top. It was you that I had in mind. Yeah, please, let's hear your question or observation. There are roving mics, so thank you.
Within the EU, there is something called the European Economic Area Agreement, and these EU laws that come from like the treaties, some of them have got like text of EEA relevance. This includes like the freedom of movement, and these 4 freedoms come under the EEA agreement, which each of the member states of the EU have signed, including Britain, plus Norway, Liechtenstein and Iceland. Within the EEA agreement, there is like an annex to which Liechtenstein can, a country, part of the EEA agreement, can control immigration. It's called Annex 8, and I believe to resolve the immigration solution is to negotiate within the EEA agreement this sort of protocol, which ties our like migration and that to the economic performance, which Liechtenstein does. A point to make about the EU referendum is that we should give a multiple choice to people.
Did you say a multiple choice?
Yes.
Please.
A multiple choice where the first question put to the British public is should Britain remain a member of the EU? The second option, if they choose to reject the European Union, the first question, is should Britain remain a member of the European Economic Area? The third question should link to the first one, which said if Britain rejected, if the voter rejected the EU, should they rejoin the EFTA? Do you agree with that statement about there should be a multiple
Well,
do you agree with that statement that there should be, if there's an EU referendum, a multiple choice?
Right, okay. Now, by the way, this is not to knock you. I've rather enjoyed that contribution, but it seems to me that you have an earnest desire to subject the British people not to a referendum, but to an exam.
No, I mean, not like that. But I mean, because the EU is very complex with all these treaties and that, so if we just have 3 questions in the referendum, then that'll be fine. Like in 1997, the Scottish people had like a referendum on devolution, and there was 2 questions posed.
Okay, I think we got the thrust of that. Do we remain in or come out? If we don't want to remain in, should we be part of EFTA?
Yeah.
And you also posed the question about the way in which the migration issue could be addressed through a negotiation within the European Economic Area. Can I perhaps ask David, who's...
Good idea.
I can certainly try. I mean, I think the problem with that kind of halfway house that you're suggesting is precisely the problem that Shirley was articulating, that we would have, and Helen too, that we would not have any influence over the decisions that were being taken in Brussels, but we'd still be enormously influenced by them. And I don't think it's quite as easy a relationship as perhaps you're implying in terms of the economic benefits. We'd still carry on getting economic benefits, but we'd have no input into the decision process, and we'd still be affected by everything.
But I read somewhere on like somebody's like a blog called EU Referendum that there is like a higher organisation like the World Trade Organisation with some of these guidelines that come into the EU law is from now.
Yeah, forgive me, I don't wish to be unkind. It's just that I'm quite keen to get through a number of questioners, so if you don't mind, I'll take the panel and then we'll go to the audience because I have got a further questioner, at least one I've identified. Please. We can take some more questions. Yes, I think what we'll do is we'll take the gentleman here and I'm going to try to exhort either Dave Mackay or Tony Barker to assist in our proceedings, but there's no compulsion about it. We'll take the gentleman there and then the fellow with the yellow tie here, who may or may not be a Liberal Democrat.
He's a lawyer.
David, before this referendum in 2017, David Cameron's demanding that the EU should reform itself. In what way do you think, not David Cameron, in what way do you think the EU should reform itself?
Are we collecting questions or are we going to respond?
I'm going to take one more. We'll take the gentleman here, please.
Thank you. Thank you. 2 brief things. One, sort of feeding the Eurosceptic narrative. David, you didn't mention something I expected you to mention, which was the micromanagement of anything from apples to the nationality of local football teams. Is that a problem? I was surprised that you described the Human Rights Project, and of course I have an interest. You described the Human Rights Project as fueling Euroscepticism. Are you sure? I'd like to see the evidence. Is it not possible that it's the other way round? That the Euroscepticism is feeding the Anti-Human Rights Act narrative, bearing in mind especially that it's the European Court of Justice of the EU that can strike down legislation, not the European Court of Human Rights.
Thank you. So, approach to reform, the question of how people see the regulatory burden and the shape of bananas, etc., and the issue of jurisprudence. And can we take one other, the lady there, please? And then I'll ask colleagues on the panel to come in. Thank you.
It slightly follows on from what this gentleman just said, which is, I was interested to see that you took the causal arrow as being from the beliefs to the Euroscepticism, whereas I have a kind of sense that there's an emotional component to Euroscepticism, that perhaps people actually, they feel Eurosceptic, so when they see something that looks like an argument against the European Union, they tend to say, yes, I think that's a negative thing about the European Union. I think that might even reflect on why people say they're anti-European Court of Justice, because they're anti-European and they just see they're going to say anything that is sort of an argument against European integration in general.
So you think the visceral comes first, in other words?
I think the relationship is more complex than necessarily those beliefs driving Euroscepticism.
Okay, David,
Can I address both those? There's really 2 points, actually, even though 3 people were making them. What should the EU do to change itself? Geoffrey, I think the very simple thing that it should do is to split the Eurozone. I think there should be a really serious dialogue about the European Central Bank being made responsible for operating two currencies, one in the southern zone and one in the northern zone, which would have different currency values, which would allow the South to compete itself back into economic activity. Because as long as countries like Italy, Greece, Portugal, Spain are imprisoned inside the euro, they are never going to be able to compete with German and Northern European efficiency. They are never going to be able to assemble the resources internally to make the investment that's needed to make them competitive. They are never going to get the resources from the Central European authorities to do that. And I can see them, the southern zone countries continuing in recession and pulling down the northern part of the Eurozone. So my policy prescription, difficult and complex though it would be that a serious debate should be held about splitting the Eurozone. On your question and Nigel's question about endogeneity, of course you're right. I mean, there's always an issue with any kind of argument about which direction does the causal arrow go. And I've not had chance yet to do any statistical analysis on this to try and test to see which way that arrow might go. That said, let me tell you why I think it goes in the direction that I was suggesting rather than the one that you're presenting. Euroscepticism is a relatively recent phenomenon. I mean, it's always been there in pockets in the discourse, but it's become much more prominent in recent years. But deep-seated authoritarianism in the British public has been there long before any concerns about the European Court of Human Rights or human rights issues came along. One of the things that we found on the British election study year after year after year was that if you asked people to place themselves on scales where you have support of human rights at one end, nice liberal fluffy things that we all like at one end, and hard vicious authoritarianism of the sort of thing that I like on the other end, then most people really, I mean really most people put themselves here. And not only do they put themselves here, they put all the parties much to the fluffy end of the spectrum. And there is a big distance between where they are and where the parties are, where you nice liberals are. Now, I'm a liberal, really, I'm joking. That's there, and that's been there for a long time. And I think that's what underpins this resistance to the decisions that the European Court of Justice makes and the decisions that the European Court of Human Rights makes. It's this deep-seated authoritarianism that's at the core of it. And I think that is then there to be exploited by Eurosceptic parties, movements, and they've exploited it very well. But I would argue that notwithstanding your very plausible case and my recognition of the general problem of trying to establish causal direction, I think the dominant causal direction is from that deep-seated authoritarianism that's creating both of these other two things.
Helen.
EEA, not a good option as far as I'm concerned. Micromanagement, I don't know whether you're a gardener. EU pesticides legislation is the legislation I break frequently by using all kinds of otherwise banned substances in my back garden. And I know there's a serious gardening community that gets very upset about. However, it is the case, as I'm sure you're extremely well aware, that many of these apparently obnoxious and silly pieces of legislation have been greeted with enthusiasm by British negotiators. And it's extremely easy to scapegoat Brussels for things in which we've actually been complicit. And it comes back to a version of David's point about stories. We don't always tell the stories right. We don't always tell the stories right. And I think part of the British problem is we haven't told those stories right. Why can I use Jay's fluid to clean my patio but not to get rid of honey fungus? But we don't tell the things we've achieved of a more positive kind right either. And I think that it inhabits, and actually I have a bit of sympathy with your point. You could do a similar set of statements about distaste for British politics and get very high levels of agreement about how little politicians are trusted. Thank you.
Thank you. Tony.
A very quick point, which is really a question to David. I sometimes wonder whether post-entry Euroscepticism owes something to the fact that large numbers of people in Britain now think they've been cheated twice. First, and I wrote a book a long time ago about the 1975 referendum, and I have researched that again and again over the years, and I'm left with a distinct impression that the Eurosceptics are right when they say that the propaganda in favor of joining in the early 70s grossly underestimated the extent to which the European Union, or the European Community as it then was, would become part of British political life. It was seen simply as it was sold, that's the better word, as the common market. And then I think the second point at which people feel cheated is that well, both major political parties, all of the main political parties, certainly the government of the day, grossly underestimated what the consequences would be of enabling people from the accession states to become part of the free market in labour across the European Union. Nobody got up and said there may be a low intake of people, there may be a high intake of people, we don't quite know, we're taking a chance. I just have a hunch that a lot of, I agree with John by the way, a lot of this I think is less deep-seated than people imagine, but I think a good deal of Euroscepticism is owing to the fact that twice they've been sold something that they didn't think they were buying. Does that make sense, David? That's really
it does, and there's one phrase that I had on one of the slides. We didn't sign up for this, and yes, I do think that is a genuine feeling that people have. Absolutely.
I suppose it's a question of recognising that most people just saw the strap lines at the time of the 75 campaign. I mean, to be fair to the real Euro enthusiasts, I'm quite certain that you could point to speeches that Ted Heath made in which he argued intellectually the case for an integrated Europe, and certainly it was always part of the vision of Roy Jenkins, but actually in the referendum campaign the thrust of the argument for staying in was economically it works, and if you come out economically it'll hurt, and that's what's I think ingrained in people's consciousness, hence the sense of resentment and in some cases even of betrayal. Shirley.
Well, I'm going to take on two of the comments from the panel because I don't agree with them. I don't agree with what has just been said by John because I think people have forgotten that the colossal impact of the sense there could never be another war in Western Europe was a very fundamental part of what made people come out in favour of the European Union. And I think we've simply forgotten. And although it's fascinating that the youngest generation is the most pro-European, it's not pro-European because it worries about there being another war in Europe. In 1975, after all, don't forget now, 45 years ago, that was a very, very common thought. Oh my God, we can't go through this again. And if you look at the way in which, for example, right now, the British public is following avidly the commemoration of the First World War, you can see how powerful that is if you seem to be within reach. At the moment, it doesn't seem to be within reach. But it may come back. That brings me to my second point, which we haven't talked about very much, but needs to be said. David said in his lecture some very powerful things about external factors. One of those external factors, without any doubt, is the rise of extreme Islamic terrorism like ISIS. And a second factor, without any doubt, is the attitude of Mr. Putin towards Ukraine and Georgia, which is beginning to make Western and Middle Europe again feel vulnerable. We really haven't felt vulnerable for a very long time, not since certainly the breaking of the Berlin Wall. And I think I begin to see creeping in, again, a sense of vulnerability which could drive people into saying, for God's sake, let's hold on to NERS for fear of something worse, and NERS is, in fact, the European Union. The second thing I don't agree with is going back to something that was said, and I think it was raised really by Geoffrey to some extent, and that is the issue of reform. I think the problem with the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, is that he always talks about reform in terms of British interests. That's about as daft a way of selling it to the other 27 nations as you could possibly think of. What he should be doing is saying, we want to reform the European Union so that the European Union itself will be stronger, more popular, more open, more transparent. Not, please guys, join us because I would like to go on being Prime Minister and you can help me to be that. What use is that when... The third disagreement, by my charm, is that it's really the point. I don't agree with the point made by David. Yes, we have been in the past an authoritarian country, but surely one of the biggest gaps between the oldest generation and the youngest generation is precisely on being authoritarian. And look at, for example, the attitude towards homosexuality, to take just one example. You couldn't have believed that could be held in Britain 35 years ago. It seemed to be an impossible dream to have. But we have as a country become, at the youngest level, not the oldest level, the youngest level, far less authoritarian than we used to be. And finally, I would say to David that although it may be true that the elites are authoritarian, and to some extent the older generation is an authoritarian, it's also true that in this country, at the elite level, there's an enthusiasm for fundamental human rights, which is quite extraordinary. You don't see the numbers buying into Amnesty International or into the human rights issues or the rest of it in most other countries in Europe. And I don't say that in a Eurosceptic way. I say it because it's been a very, very long characteristic of this country that there has been a devotion to the concept, maybe if you like, other people's human rights. But it's been there, it's been strong, and it's been, I think, very strong in the Commonwealth as well as in the metropolitan country.
Thank you. Let's have some more contributions from the floor. Yes, I spotted the gentleman in the fourth row. And sorry, I don't wish to, yeah, I'm looking for some female contributors. Were you just waving your arm, madam? No, good, you wish to take part, good. We'll hear from the gentleman there, the lady there, and the lady sitting next to the gentleman with the beard. Yes, thank you. Sir.
In the event that the UK decided to leave the EU in 2017, would that immediately open the question of nationalist referenda up in Scotland, potentially Wales? And if it did, would that not be a good reason to add to the challenges to Eurosceptics of how they intend to hold the Union together, the one that they want to leave the EU?
Thank you. And our second contributor, lady in the front row, thank you.
First of all, I'd like to say I have the embarrassment of living in the first UKIP constituency. Yes, and yes, there's a lot of older people there, and I think it's very right. There is this nostalgia for empire and that sort of thing. They also do link the European Court of Human Rights with EU, and right, there's those authoritarian attitudes. So that's my comment. I also agree with you that at the 11th, 59th minute of the last hour, people will want to stick to what's there. I don't think enough is made of the complications, and I'd like views on the complications of coming out of Europe, because it's not simply we buy and they sell, okay, or whatever, but we buy things that we make into other things, and that is all very complicated. I have a son who works, managed a factory, and he says how difficult it would be. So that's my...
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. Those are the first two. As I say, the lady back there, and I'm told there's a gentleman with a grey shirt who's been... Yes. That gentleman there, yes. So, lady here, and then the gentleman there, and then we'll have some answers. Thank you.
Okay, I have a semi-comment and a linked point and a question.
Okay.
So I think, David, that you really underestimate the kind of visceral anti-immigrant story. If you go and sit in Clacton for 5 minutes, I think you would recognize that it's not going to be not giving benefits, because you will hear that the schools are overcrowded and the kids don't speak English and the health service is under strain, and it's immigrants. And these are immigrants that are linked to EU immigration. So I think that's a bit, may I say, naive to such a eminent and sophisticated analyst. So The second dimension is, I wonder if you saw the story about the Hungarians coming in to make sandwiches. And I wondered if you think, the economist side of you, that this immigration of young people to sandwich factories is feeding the kind of low-wage, low-skill economy and discouraging the investment that we need, and therefore causing some quite immediate problems that themselves continue to feed into disillusion with the political process. My question is, why do you think there's been such a leadership failure? Why are the leaders not going on and on 500 times repeating all the ways in which the EU is good for us? Because they do claim to believe this, but they are dire. I agree with you totally on that point.
Okay.
They have failed utterly.
Thank you. And the fourth question of that gentleman there, and then I'll ask the panel to respond. Thank you.
Thank you. Going back to something that Shirley Williams said, you seem to suggest that Germany was the powerhouse in relation to the fiscal union. Now, could that lead to the argument that Germany is too powerful within Europe?
Okay, the first question related to the referendum and a throwback to the recent Scottish experience. The lady here asked about the difficulties and complications of coming out. Why the failure of leadership? And is Germany simply too powerful within the current European Union construct? Okay, shall we stick to the pattern? David?
I wish I knew the answers to these questions, and I don't think there are any clear answers. I mean, I think that the first two questions are almost the same question, actually. What are the complications if the British public were to vote to leave the European Union? There would be a huge problem with Scotland and Wales if they voted to stay inside. If the balance of opinion there was to stay inside, then immediately the Scottish independence issue would re-emerge, and presumably there would be a new pressure inside Wales for a different view as well. So I think those kind of regional or country, national complications would certainly be there. And you're absolutely right in terms of economic complications. There really is no telling what they might be, because it would all depend on what happened to treaties. There would be need for renegotiation. I mean, imagine as well just the ways in which regional funds are distributed now, the way that educational funds are distributed now. What would happen to those? What would happen to grants that had already been awarded to universities, for example, to conduct research? Would they carry on getting them? Would they not? So, I mean, the complications would be immense, and I don't think people have thought that through at all. On Francis's point, this kind of visceral anti-immigrant feeling, I do understand that there is visceral anti-immigrant feeling in certain parts, in certain places. I've heard it myself on occasion. And I think the key is to have policies that minimize the chances of that visceral anti-immigrant feeling from being articulated and mobilized by political parties. And while I'm not suggesting that moving to a contributory benefits system would be a solution, what I think it would do would be to undercut part of the case. Now, it's still not going to solve the problem. You're still going to have that cultural resistance when people feel things are changing more rapidly than they want. But we know historically that for the last 50 years, we've had immigration in which there have been cultural contradictions, and we've been able to accommodate them. We've found ways of doing it through legislation, through anti-discrimination legislation, and so on. Now, I'm not suggesting there are easy solutions at all, but I think there are solutions, and I simply think that the benefits approach is one possible way of taking some of the heat out. The question on why there's a failure of leadership, I think there's been a failure of leadership not just in terms of the European Union. I think there's been a failure of leadership on a much wider scale than that for a much longer period of time. And if I've got my real cynical hat on now, the thing that I think we're lacking in British politics is the one thing that's being taken out of it by the move to taking note of opinion polls and people like me, the move to the centre, everybody trying to demonstrate competence at management of the economy and the society, rather than actually having clear ideological positions, clear principled positions that they then follow through and defend. Now, of course, the last British politician who was famous for doing that is someone whom you might not agree with and I might not agree with, but nonetheless I do think we need to return to conviction politicians who might provide some leadership.
David, thank you. Helen.
Is Germany too powerful? Well, Germany is certainly very powerful, partly because the other, certainly larger member states are not cutting the mustard either. So there's a weakness in France, there's a weakness in Italy, there's weakness in Spain, and the UK's on the blink. So I think it's important to see the wider constellation and not just the German hegemony point. On the connection with the devolution issue, I think these things are deeply intertwined. We will get a countrywide breakdown of votes if we have a referendum on EU membership, and depending on what those figures show, I worry about Ireland. I worry about Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, just as I worry about the idea of physical borders being introduced between the 6 counties and the Republic. On the complications of withdrawal, those who wish to be really nerdish about it could look at the government's balance of competencies review, which you'll get all kinds of details on. On the immigration point, those of us who do doorstep politics get the anti-immigration stuff all the time, Francis, and it's deeply distressing. And that's one of the things that worries me most. I would like David to do, maybe with the help of his son, to do some more research on the 2-year, the 2-year benefits question.
Oh, no, there.
Okay, hiya. The 2-year benefits issue, because I can see why people agreed with it, but you didn't ask them if that was enough. So you need a ladder of options there. On the older people, UKIP, UKIP is a kind of English nationalist party. I think there's a change occurred since the history role that David talks about, in the sense the UKIP pitch is not about going back to that old imperial nostalgia. It's about Little England stepping off and being parochial, and a disavowing of international responsibilities, and that may be a step change from David's conversation. On the how to win the referendum, votes at 16 seems to be the answer. Thank you.
Helen, thank you. Okay, Tony and then Shirley, please.
I'm going to be very quick because I can see the clock, which is up there, rather than visible to most of the people present. Just one thought about 2017. People have not been, in the course of this discussion and in the course of many others, been distinguishing between what would happen if the Conservatives had an overall majority after the next general election and made it clear that they intended to have a referendum in 2017, and the referendum itself. The effect of announcing that there was going to be an in-out referendum would be either instantaneous or would already have begun to happen even before the election, with inward investors, for example, deciding that they were going to place their inward investment somewhere else. In other words, I think the economic effects of that gap would make the chances of our staying in greater rather than less, because people would see the cost of pulling out. One other very quick point, I think one of the reasons why we've had so little leadership on European questions in general probably relates to a phrase that amazingly hasn't been used at all this evening, the media. The fact is that the British media, uniquely in Europe, I think I'm right in saying, by which I mean widely read newspapers, are markedly hostile, the ones that are read by large numbers of people, to the whole European project. And my strong impression is that to an even greater degree than people realize, party leaders in this country run scared, in particular, of the Sun and the Daily Mail. I think that's not a factor to be eliminated from the conversation.
Shirley.
Yeah, really very quickly, Three things, really. I mean, the first thing is that I think that it's, I completely agree with what Tony just said about the media. I mean, let me be very blunt. I wouldn't go in for being an MP today. I wouldn't dream of it. It would be hell, because you are treated as if you were rubbish or corrupt or bound to be corrupted. You are hammered very hard for any view which is somewhat unusual or new, and you are treated increasingly as being part of what is increasingly, sadly, becoming a professionalised political world. Look at the way in which MP after MP, candidate after candidate, comes out of the ranks of interns, young men and women, mostly from the southeast of England, who get into politics to act as interns, often unpaid or very badly paid, because they want to be MPs. Look at the number that then move on to being MPs. Look at how rare it is anymore to see somebody who's had a long profession as a teacher or an electrician or a miner or a wellwoman in the Commons, and you don't see them anymore, or very rarely. So you're getting a detachment again between people who are elected politicians and their constituents. And I think that's making it increasingly difficult for people to actually make common cause with their members of parliament, which is a great shame, because many MPs are actually devoted and hard-working and conscientious people, but you wouldn't believe it from reading The Sun, the Daily Mail. There's nobody gets that credit, really. Number two, I agree with what I actually think myself that 2017 is irrelevant. I think we're going to see in the next general election, whoever gets a plurality, I don't personally think anyone will get a majority. The Conservatives may come close. I think there'll be a plurality again. The issues in terms of the impact on political parties of where we stand on the European Union and on the campaign running up to the 2017 referendum is actually going to decide the outcome of that referendum a year and a half early, in my view. The Conservatives will find it very hard to hold together if they have to decide whether they're going to take a position on the referendum well in advance of what's happening. The Liberal Democrats and Labour will then be under huge pressure as to where they stand on Europe, not in 2017, but in 2015. I think we're underestimating the extraordinary fragmentalism of the British political system at the present time. I think what we're going to see is huge pressures on political parties to know where they stand, what they believe in, what their principles are, and what concessions they will make in order to become, for example, part of a coalition.
Well, as has been said, we are running late. I'm going to ask if there is one further contribution. Joe, I think you had your hand up a few minutes ago. No? Oh, OK. I will take one last observation if it is brief. The lady, OK, all right. The lady there and then the gentleman there. You'll have to be even briefer, and then we'll wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you. David, I was particularly fascinated by the points you made about the 2-year rule that you proposed and the fact that 1.4 Brits live and work...
Sorry, could you speak up? I couldn't hear. Forgive me.
Sorry. I was fascinated by your point, David, about the 2-year rule that you were suggesting, and also the fact that 1.4 Brits live and work in other EU countries. It seems to me that in the media, particularly, we don't hear enough about enough analysis about the contrast between those sorts of either proposals or arrangements or facts, what Brits do, what we might have in terms of arrangements, and what other EU countries do or might have. And my point really is, let's have more analysis, and I'd really like to hear from you what you think about that.
OK, I'm going to suggest that David, as our star guest, should answer these questions, and perhaps nobody else, but the rest of us will exercise a self-denying ordinance. Can we just take the one other contributor, the gentleman in the 9th row back, I think, something like that? OK, well, we'll take one more. I'm being rather generous. Of course. And that gentleman there was going to contribute, and then we really must wrap up. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I'll be very brief, as I was when I spoke last in Brussels. I think there's a whole lot of idiots down there making a whole lot of idiotic laws. They're not fit for purpose. Why don't they resign? It went right round the world on the tape, that remark. perhaps you remember. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and the gentleman there, and then I think we do need to draw to a close, and I'll ask David pithily to reply, which he will.
Just a brief observation. I'm fascinated by the difference between
today,
young people and older people in this issue. And it strikes me that younger people in this country are much more likely to be foreign-born or children of foreign parents. And that is something that's not easily captured, because if you're born in this country, you might not consider yourself to be an ethnic minority, but you might have cousins, parents, grandparents who are from other countries in Europe. And if they come from other parts of the world, not inherit that kind of empire nostalgia that native-born Brits would have from an older generation.
Thank you. Okay, a response to all three.
Okay.
Wrapped up in one.
Yeah.
David.
More analysis, more facts, better presented to the British electorate. Yes, we've got to have more. There's no question of that. And we've got somehow to break the stranglehold of the Eurosceptic press so to do. People in Brussels, obviously a lot of people share your view about a lot of them, there's no question of that. And in terms of the young, Andrew, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And this goes back to one of the questions that Shirley posed, and of course then answered herself. No, I mean, you mentioned the kind of networks that young people have, and I mean, I think that's absolutely right. I think those family connections that people have too are all associated with the idea of multiple identities. And I think young people are far more capable now, because of the world in which they've grown up, of having multiple identities, and that it's perfectly possible to think of yourself as British, as English, as Scottish, as Muslim, as European. All of these things can coexist simultaneously. And I think the more that happens, the better.
Okay, now, ladies and gentlemen, I must just ask you, and I do so in a sort of Jonathan Dimbleby fashion, this is not a scientific study or poll, which of you presently intends in an upcoming referendum to vote for Britain to remain in the European Union? Please show. Thank you. And which of you intends in an upcoming European referendum to vote to withdraw for Britain to come out? Well, in this audience, it is something like 10 to 1 for staying in. I don't say that proves anything, but it is of great interest. Look, thank you very much for coming. Shirley Williams, in the course of a whole series of fascinating and illuminating observations, just mentioned towards the end that one deterrent to participation in politics, to entry into a political career, is the abrasive media that we have. Although I must say it's always better to have a free and abusive press than an unfree and less abusive press. And my own observation some years ago, I think in the course of an interview, unscripted, was that the Daily Mail was a racist, sexist, bigoted, homophobic comic cartoon strip, and I've never seen any reason to revise that verdict, I'm bound to say. But I've never regarded it as a deterrent, because this probably sounds rather smug, but it is not intended to be. I really just think that you shouldn't bother about that which you cannot control. And these various disparate organs are perfectly entitled to their views, but very frequently they suffer from the quite material disadvantage of being wrong. And I have to say, on a day-to-day basis, I really don't take any notice. It just doesn't matter. I think you've just got to get on, whether you're an academic or a journalist or a politician. And this goes back to what David said a few moments ago, and just do what you think is right, rather than constantly trying to guess whether if you shift a bit this way or a bit that, people will be more likely to agree with you. And that, I suppose, is a cri de coeur in support of conviction, not just amongst politicians, but in all walks of life. It's been huge fun to have this audience. I think we owe a great debt of gratitude to all of our panel. Tony King has been a force for good and progress in this university for half a century, and I'd like you to give each of our panelists a great round of applause. Tony King, please. Professor Dame Helen Wallace for the academic studies that she's done, for the rooted conviction and principle that she put on display again tonight, and for all that you've contributed, Helen, over decades to the study of politics and to the championing of the cause of a progressive European Union. Please show your appreciation. We're always told that politicians are unpopular, but in my experience, and I witnessed this on the train, ladies and gentlemen, this afternoon from Liverpool Street to Colchester, the number of people who noticed Shirley with approval, and indeed, I'm not sure she noticed, but I did, with approval and with affection. And that is because she is one of the least self-regarding, most principled, and most effective communicators in British politics in this or any generation. Last but not least, and indeed I would say above all, tonight of all nights, thanks, David, and congratulations to you. David taught me 25 years ago. He was a brilliant and inspirational teacher, always keen to engage, ever ready to encourage, completely devoid of side, pomposity, or artifice, or anything of that sort. And I regard it as a privilege to continue to know and interact with him. When I heard that a Regius Professorship was coming to Essex and that David was getting it, I remember exactly where I was standing in my study in Parliament, and I literally jumped for joy. And I was absolutely thrilled, and there couldn't be anyone more deserving for his lecture tonight, for decades of commitment, and for all that is still to flow from his pen and from his brain. Please show your appreciation of David Sanders. Thank you and good night.